Male and female cats don't bond with you in the same way, and one of them builds a deeper kind of attachment that takes longer to notice. Most people judge this by how often their cat comes close. But frequency only shows what happens on the surface, not how the connection is formed underneath. By the end of this, you'll understand which one feels more affectionate. But the last reason is the one that explains why the difference exists at all. The first difference appears in how often they choose to approach you. Male cats tend to initiate contact more frequently, returning even after short gaps in interaction. They move in and out of your space with very little hesitation. That repetition creates a steady presence that feels constant over time. Female cats tend to pause before approaching. That pause introduces a moment of evaluation that changes how the interaction begins. Have you ever noticed how one cat approaches immediately while another seems to wait before moving closer? That difference often begins before the interaction even takes shape. Male cats create connection through repeated contact. Each small interaction reinforces the previous one and keeps the pattern active. Female cats create connection through selected moments. They engage less often, but each approach carries more intention. And this is where the pattern begins to shift. Because what feels stronger at first doesn't always reflect how the bond is actually built. The second difference shows up in how long they stay once interaction begins. Male cats tend to maintain contact for longer stretches without needing a clear reason. They remain close, follow movement, and stay engaged even when nothing specific is happening. This creates a continuous flow that feels stable and easy to recognize. Female cats often engage in shorter, more defined interactions. They approach, interact briefly, and then step away again with a clear ending. That shorter interaction can feel less intense at first glance. But over time, it starts forming a more structured pattern. Have you ever noticed how continuous interaction becomes something you expect, while brief interaction becomes something you notice each time it happens? That difference begins shaping how attachment is perceived, and perception often determines what feels more meaningful. Male cats create visible attachment through duration. Their behavior stays in front of you long enough to become familiar. Female cats create defined attachment through limits. Their behavior holds shape because it begins and ends more clearly. If you're starting to recognize some of these patterns in your own cat, it's worth staying with this a little longer. Because the next part connects behaviors that usually feel separate, and once you see that connection, the way your cat acts around you starts to make a lot more sense. And if this kind of detail is something you naturally pay attention to, then staying connected here will help you notice even more of it over time. Because once you begin seeing these patterns, they tend to show up everywhere in how your cat behaves. The third difference appears in how familiarity is reinforced over time. Male cats rely on repetition to maintain connection, returning again and again to the same behavior. Each interaction strengthens a loop that keeps repeating. That loop builds a pattern that feels reliable and predictable. Female cats rely on recognition rather than repetition. They return based on internal confirmation rather than constant reinforcement. Have you ever noticed how something repeated often becomes part of the background, while something chosen carefully stands out every time it happens? That contrast changes how connection is experienced. Because repetition blends into routine, while selection creates definition. Male cats maintain familiarity through frequency. Female cats maintain familiarity through consistency of choice. And this is where the pattern begins to deepen further. Because connection is no longer about how often it appears. It becomes about how it is sustained. And that difference carries into everything that follows. The fourth difference shows up in how each responds to changes in environment. Male cats tend to carry the same interaction style across different situations. Their behavior remains similar even when surroundings shift slightly. That consistency makes their attachment easier to read. Female cats adjust their behavior based on context. They respond differently depending on comfort, timing, and familiarity with the moment. This creates a pattern that feels less predictable at first. But it also means each interaction reflects a more specific decision. Have you ever noticed how one cat behaves similarly no matter where they are, while another changes depending on how the situation feels? That shift reveals how differently they process connection. Because one relies on pattern, while the other relies on evaluation. Male cats extend their behavior across situations. Female cats refine their behavior within each situation. And this is where interpretation starts to become misleading, because consistency is easier to recognize than adaptation. The final difference explains everything that comes before it, because it changes how both patterns should be understood completely. Male cats build attachment through continuous presence. Their behavior remains visible because it is reinforced again and again. Female cats build attachment through selective commitment. They engage less often, but each interaction reflects a clearer internal decision. Have you ever noticed how something that happens constantly feels stronger at first, while something chosen carefully begins to feel more defined over time? That's where the distinction becomes clear. One creates connection through frequency, while the other creates it through structure. Male cats often feel more affectionate because their behavior is easier to observe. It happens often enough to become familiar without needing attention. Female cats often feel less expressive because their behavior appears less frequently. But each interaction carries more weight because it is chosen. And this is where the entire comparison shifts, because the question itself starts to change. It becomes less about which one shows more affection, and more about how that connection is formed and maintained. Male cats repeat the connection. Female cats decide the connection. That difference shapes how the bond develops over time, because repetition builds presence, while decision builds structure. Once you start noticing these patterns, your cat's behavior begins to follow a structure that becomes easier to read over time. And when that happens, interactions that once felt unclear start to feel more predictable and easier to understand. If this changed the way you see your cat even slightly, staying connected here will keep that clarity building over time. Because the more you pay attention to these patterns, the more consistently they begin to appear in everyday moments. The way your cat connects with you is never just a single action. It's a pattern that builds gradually, often in ways that are easy to miss. If you want to keep noticing these patterns as they happen, subscribe and stay with this, because the more attention you give to it, the clearer your cat's behavior becomes.